Welcome to Module 8 of Collaborative Management. This week we will be covering the topic networks in a global context. The learning objectives for this week consist of assessing and describing the various theories, concepts, tools, and techniques relating to collaborative and network governance, identify major opportunities and obstacles of international public management networks, assess structure, leadership, and operations of international networks, and lastly, recognize that written communication skills are vital for public sector managers in inter-organizational collaboration settings. So it was important to me to add in this module for you this summer session, and I wanted to give you some context about networks from an international perspective. And so I wanted you to read about how networks work from a global perspective. And so this week you'll be reading a lot about how networks work globally and how they're similar in some ways to networks here in the United States. Again, for networks, I'm talking about public management networks. And also, too, it'll give a sense of how we address problems from a global perspective, whether it be healthcare or whether it be some broader issue related to the world economy. And so, again, we'll talk a lot about that, and you'll read a lot about that this week in the Mandel text. And so we talked about this earlier in this semester in terms of why we have networks. We talked about this in week one, I believe, and in terms of why we need networks. And so we think about a lot of the complex problems that we have from just United States perspective. Think about what globalization does to the complexity of how we have to solve issues from a global perspective. And so when we think about globalization requires that we think about ways in which to manage our joint activities and our shared interests. And so for many challenges that we confront today and beyond the reach of any state to meet on its own. And so you think about the economic challenges that we face as a nation, and you think about the healthcare crisis that we face as a nation, and you think about how developing countries are facing issues related to their economies or to healthcare or to employment or to adequate housing. You look at the national level, we must govern better, but at the international level, we must learn to govern better together. And so effective states are essential for both tasks and their capacity for both needs strengthening. So we must also adapt international institutions through which states can govern together to the realities of this new era. And so we must form coalitions for change, and we must often work with partners beyond the precincts and beyond our walls. And we must also work to mobilize the skills and other resources of diverse global actors. Therefore, hopefully, with the intent of increasing and involving formal, developing formal global public management networks that can cut across national and institutional lines. And so, from protecting the environment and from fighting diseases such as malaria, AIDS, and to instituting labor standards and to combating corruption, many problems of this interconnected world cannot be tackled by traditional politics alone and really can't be tackled by one nation or state alone. And so we really need global public management networks, or in this case, you'll read a lot too about global public policy networks. And so this concept of global public policy networks has emerged as an innovative response, bringing together civil society, so like nonprofit organizations and other NGOs, private enterprises, international organizations, and governments and coalitions for change. And these issue based alliances have a flexible structure that can quickly meet the challenges of globalization, evolving with the changing nature of the issue. And so, as coalitions for change, they not only bridge the growing distance among policymakers and citizens and entrepreneurs and, and activists, they also demonstrate that with the help of modern communication and outreach, successful collective action is possible in an ever more complex and interdependent world. So, again, the use of global public policy networks is becoming very popular, especially over the past 10 to 15 years, to really address issues related to protecting the environment. So you think about like climate change has become a really core issue from a global perspective, and many countries are working together to address that issue. When you think about AIDS, and you think about diseases, you think about labor standards, and you think about combating corruption. These are all issues that are being addressed through referred to as global public policy networks. And outside of just having private businesses and international organizations, we also have governments, national governments that are in these coalitions for change. So, in recent years, transnational multi-sectoral initiatives that bring together the public, private, and not-for-profit sector and loose issue-based networks have received growing attention among academics and policymakers alike. And so far, however, systematic knowledge about these global public policy networks is scant and incomplete at best. And we know only a little bit about their characteristics and their functions, and we don't really know much about their strengths and their weaknesses. And even in the public management literature, we haven't really done a good job from a comparative standpoint looking at networks from a global perspective, or even looking at how public management networks are organized in developing countries, or even in countries that are more economically sound. When you think about places in Europe, so you think about the UK, you think about places like China, and so we're just now beginning to look at how governance works in places outside the United States, especially as it works to networking. So, but I want to tell you about kind of like what we know so far, and you'll spend a lot of time reading about this in the text this week. And so, what we do know is that global public policy networks come in a wide range of forms and perform a multitude of functions. There's no clear-cut typology of networks, so we really don't know. And so you learn a lot about different networks, different types of networks. So we have informational networks, we have outreach networks, but we don't know whether or not that typology is applicable or the same when we look at countries outside of the United States. So again, it'd be really interesting to kind of take those typologies that have been developed by Robert Argonoff to get a sense of whether or not that matters when we look outside the walls of the United States. And it's something that you even may want to consider in your discussion this week. So cooperation in networks is based on the premise that none of the groups involved can address the issue at stake by itself. So as a result, multi-sectoral networks create bridges on a transnational scale among the public sector, the private sector, and also civil society that reflect the changing roles and relative importance among those groups, and that pull their diverse resources together. So cooperation is key, even from a global perspective. And again, looking at public management networks, or networks in general in other countries, this is paramount. Cooperation is important, but also thinking about things like trust, decision making, things that we talked about, coordination, things that we talked about earlier this semester. Think about how those things apply. So when you're reading through the case studies this week, think about how those issues are the same or different from a global perspective. Flexibility also is important. So when we think about public policy networks, for example, they come in various forms and organizational shapes that can also adjust through the process of cooperation. So again, these are very flexible forms. Uh, Global public policy networks have developed in a multitude of issue areas and fulfill various functions. Some functions are negotiation platforms that facilitate the setting of global standards and regulations with the participation of the public and private sectors, as well as civil society. Other networks serve primarily as coordination mechanisms that help to bring scarce resources to their most effective use and to correct or deepen markets. And finally, a substantial number of implementation networks have sprung up as innovative answers to the challenge of implementing existing international treaties. So this week you'll be learning about policy networks and public management networks from a global context, and you will learn about the successes in these structures and some struggles. And you will read about cross-sectoral networks in developing countries. You will discover Hong Kong's experiences of designing a network, and you will learn about the New South Wales demonstration project in integrated community care. And as you read these case studies, think about what you have learned so far in the semester in the U.S. context, and how and what advice you could provide public managers in other countries as it relates to designing the network, or as it results to managing and resolving conflict things that we've talked about so far over the weeks, or how accountability works, or even how you manage effectiveness from a global standpoint. So think about these issues that we talked about, how you can apply these concepts to these global public policy networks. So again, as always, if you have any further questions, I look forward to you sending me an email about that, or shooting me, or rather giving me a phone call. And as always, have a great week, and I look forward to interacting with you via Blackboard.